Buonasera a tutti. Good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners. Also be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past video interviews. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo. Grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. Today we'll have a great conversation with director and producer Zac Baliva about his latest achievement, the documentary Potentially Dangerous, When It Was a Crime Being Italian. This is an eye-opening documentary that looks at the treatment of immigrants during World War II. But before bringing Zac to the program, little pubblicità. Parli italiano? Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org. Well, welcome. Buonasera, benvenuto al programma. Zac, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to talk to you a little bit and to share about this documentary with you and your listeners. Very happy to be here.
Well, the pleasure is all mine because we're going to dive into a topic that is not very well known, which is part of the American history, but also clearly and directly affects the Italian experience during World War II. But before we get into the juice, so to speak, of the conversation, I would like to, for you to share a little bit about yourself with our audience. We're always trying to establish also a connection to Italy. I know that you started as a writer, producer of the hit TV show ER. I don't know if you can tell us anything about what was it like?
Yeah. I'd love to, and you can see kind of when you learn a little bit about my background, kind of how it all comes together in this latest documentary, Potentially Dangerous. I grew up in the Midwest, in Illinois, in and around Springfield. I went to film school at Columbia College in Chicago, and growing up in this Italian-American family, I sort of knew that was part of my heritage, of course, but none of my family spoke Italian, and I was kind of always wondering why I didn't have a deeper connection to Italy. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but important to mention here right at the onset. So I graduated in 2003, moved out to Hollywood without a job lined up, and very quickly after moving to the LA area, found myself working on the Warner Brothers lot and working for the producers of ER at a company called John Wells Productions. John Wells is a prolific producer, still very active on hit TV shows today. At the time, he was producing ER and West Wing and a show about firemen called Third Watch, and also feature films. So I wasn't directly producing ER or writing for the show, but I was learning all aspects of the industry by working directly for the writers and producers of that show. I was an assistant to one of the writers and directors, Virgil Williams, who went on to earn an Academy Award nomination for writing the movie Mudbound a couple years ago. And I was also managing the writer's office. And so as you can imagine, it was a really great hands-on learning experience being there for the last 5 seasons of one of the most popular and most well-watched shows in American TV history, because I got to learn a little bit of everything. When they were editing, I was working with the editors. When they were on set, I was on set with Virgil. When they were doing meetings with the networks and with the lawyers, I got to see a little bit of everything, the casting process and sort of beginning, middle, and end. And it was a really, really valuable experience to be there during that time. And that's really how I launched my career and, put myself in a position where I was learning from some of the greatest producers that were working at the time. I'm really thankful to have had that opportunity.
So obviously, I get also an idea that living and working that lifestyle, you probably had very little time left, very little time off. I'm sure the pace of everything, it should have got done yesterday. So at what point did you find time, or you were at a point in your life where you said, let me step back, let me trace back the family, and also where is your family originally from?
Yeah, great question. So exactly true. We were working very long days. I mean, when we were shooting, it's not uncommon to shoot for 16 hours. And anytime that the show was in production, I would be there kind of in the office, making sure there were no emergencies or anything that needed to be addressed. And so there was very little time for extracurriculars. And that actually plays into part of my story, because I started to become aware that because my family is from Italy, originally from Abruzzo, that I knew that I could have my citizenship in Italy recognized, but frankly, there just wasn't the time for me to gather all the documents in my lineage to, petition them to recognize my citizenship. So unfortunately, I kind of put it on the back burner for a while. And then through the writer's strike, and that must have been 2007 or so, when the Writers Guild went on strike, I had a little bit of extra time and really started looking into it more deeply. I have a 13-year-old son now. At the time, I was married, but we didn't have children, and we sort of decided that if we were going to do it, that was the time. So I started really digging into my ancestry and learning a little bit more about my family and where they're from. My father's side is from a town called Celano, which is near Aquila. And my grandmother and her family are from a town called Penne, which is near Pescara. And so I started learning a little bit more about their history. And it's still sort of like this today, as many of your listeners probably know. Having your citizenship recognized is a very cumbersome and long process. At the time, I think there was a 2-year wait to even get an appointment at the Chicago consulate. I didn't speak Italian then. I'm not quite fluent now, many years later, but started like most people do, taking lessons and doing Rosetta Stone. I don't think Duolingo even existed then. So the first time we decided to actually go live in Italy for a while, so we moved to Rome and we lived there for a couple of years. And I had a wonderful experience at a language class in Rome where I went every day for 6 months. And on my first day, we were learning nouns. I learned how to say, parts of the room that you're sitting in, window and fan, and all of these things. Because of Rosetta Stone, I could say, my grandma has a black cat, right? But if anybody responded back to me, I couldn't say anything, or I couldn't understand their response. But it was such a wonderful experience being able to live and work in Rome for a couple of years. And then some family situations brought us back to the US. And then we did another stint in Italy right before COVID. Actually, we lived again in Venice, actually the mainland of Venice, Mestre, for another year. And again, was able to sort of level up language skills and just immerse ourselves in this country that we've come to love so much, and really take advantage now that I have the dual citizenship and the Italian passport and everything, and really trying to understand what it's like to live life there. But along the way, really feeling more connected to my family's homeland, and really understanding the story of my grandparents and great grandparents a little more deeply. And that's part of what led ultimately to this documentary that we're here to discuss today.
I wanted to share a little bit of a footage. This is going to be in Italian, so I'll try to keep it short. But you are, I believe, meeting with the mayor of Penne, and you're having this conversation about the importance of realizing where you are to then figuring out where you're going, because he makes a nice, cute parallel. And then there are also some images of you going into the archives and the archivists pulling out these books. So I just want to play out a little bit of the conversation, then we'll continue talking. It also looks that Penne is a beautiful town. I did spend some time in Abruzzo, so ciao a tutti gli abruzzesi listening, but Penne I haven't gone. So now you just gave me another little destination to add to my map. So let's see if we can share a little bit, if I have it at the right point. For those of you who are just listening, I'll give you the gist of the conversation after we're done. For those following us through YouTube, you'll be able to see the subtitles.
Per te, Penne.
Beh, io ci sono nato, quindi per me rappresenta veramente tutto. Io sono nato e sempre vissuto qui, non ho mai abbandonato questa città alla quale sono legato, non riuscirei ad immaginare la mia vita al di fuori di queste mura.
È importante conoscere le proprie radici?
Sì, sicuramente.
Perché?
Beh, io faccio sempre il paragone con il navigatore satellitare che abbiamo montato sulle macchine.
Ok.
Per conoscere dove stiamo andando, il nostro futuro, noi dobbiamo conoscere da dove siamo partiti. Il navigatore satellitare ti dice: se vuoi andare in un posto, mi devi dire da dove parti. E per me questo è il mio punto di partenza, e da qui poi posso spaziare e immaginare altri posti, altre realtà, altre esperienze.
Okay, so I'm going to reshare it just with the images, but I love how he uses the GPS analogy. It's like you have to tell your GPS where you are in order to tell them where you want to go, and your question about how important it is to find out about your roots. So how was that experience for you?
Well, it was very meaningful for me to go back to my great-grandfather's hometown and be able to see land that, you know, he used to own, and they took me down to the archives. And it's amazing in these comuni where they have, you know, marriage and birth and death certificates dating back to the 1800s. And for us, it was very important, and we should share that people can see this this little sort of featurette with subtitles if they go to the website for the film, which is potentiallydangerousfilm.com. We'll talk about the themes a little bit later, but in the documentary, we talk about what happened to Italians living in America who were seen as America's enemy aliens during World War II, given that the United States was fighting a war against Italy. Now, many of these immigrants had been living in the United States, in many cases, for decades. They had children serving in the military. In some cases, they had vibrant lives and careers here. They had no criminal records. They had never done anything to actually be considered an enemy of the United States. But because they weren't yet fully naturalized as citizens, they were seen as enemy aliens, enemies of the United States, this adopted country that they had come to love so much, sort of the reverse of my experience in some cases, going back and petitioning the Italian government to recognize my citizenship. And so we were telling this unknown part of American history and really explaining the perspective of people who were affected living here in the United States. And it was so precious and valuable to be able to go back to this small Italian town. And that was Mario Semproni, the mayor of Penne. And to be able to ask him what it was like for people during that era who would have been his parents and his grandparents, to watch these Italians, to watch their cousins, their brothers, their sisters, their friends leave Italy, only to know that they were viewed with suspicion in their new country because of the actions of the Italian government. So to have him give us that Italian perspective to this story we were telling from an American perspective was really, really valuable. And I can't be more grateful to him and to everyone who helped, kind of take me through the town and show me the site and the archives. And he was just a really deep thinker and provided a lot of really critical information and insight for us.
Yes, even because he said that, he has never left the town. He would not even be able to imagine what his life would have been leaving the town. So now you have people in Italy that are not that aware of the experience of the ones that left, and then the ones that have left, that are going through these ban, so to speak, that we're going to talk in a few minutes. Now, congratulations to you for being the winner of the 2021 Russo Brothers Italian American Film Forum. And can you tell us a little bit? So had you already your mindset set on doing this type of documentary, or kind of the combination? What is the time frame from when maybe you get awarded to produce the actual documentary? I know that it's probably not too long.
No, it was a really interesting process. After I was working on ER, I left that show in the final season to produce an independent film called My Name is Jerry, which was funded in part by Ball State University. And that film was really interesting because we gave the first on-screen role to an actor named Stephen Yeun, who's gone on to star in many seasons of The Walking Dead and actually earned an Oscar nomination for a film called Minari just a couple years ago. And so 13 years prior, we gave him his first on-screen role. And that, again, was just such an incredible experience to work on this independent film where, as a producer, I really had to do a little bit of everything. And that prepared me well for this project, because the Russo brothers are these hugely successful directors working in Hollywood. They've directed Marvel movies, they directed Avengers Endgame, and most recently were producers on the movie that just won Best Picture last weekend, Everything Everywhere All at Once. And they have a very respected production company. And because they are Italian American themselves, every year they award grants to filmmakers who seek to highlight some part of the Italian American experience. And we're, again, I know I'm throwing out this word a lot, but I really want to recognize the people who have really supported me in my career, and specifically this project. Hugely grateful for the Russo brothers, to the Italian Sons and Daughters of America. The Film Forum that year was part of an organization with the National Italian American Foundation. But the grant program that they have awards an $8,000 grant, and you have 5 months to produce a finished project. So some of the projects that others produce are, just a few minutes long. Ours is about an hour, so it's considered a feature-length documentary. And we also had the challenge of producing this during COVID with, very small production schedule, very limited budget. We did another round of crowdfunding on Kickstarter, but it really became a passion project. And when I learned of the Russo Brothers Film Forum, I knew that we wanted to enter and tell a great story, but I didn't know exactly what that story would be. Mm-hmm. And so I started doing research, and I just Googled unknown Italian story. Mm-hmm. And what happens if you do that is you pull up the work of Larry DeStasi, who has written about the Italian persecution and internment. And the title of one of his books is Una Storia Segreta, an mm-hmm. unknown history, or an unknown story. And so that's really how I found out about the fact that Italians during World War II were seen as enemy aliens and were detained and were interned, because it was this very much an unknown chapter in American history. And certainly I didn't know about it. My co-producers didn't know about it. Other Italians and Italian Americans that I talked to didn't know about it. So I called Mr. DeStasi, and often as a filmmaker, you have this unfortunate experience of finding a story that's already been told. And so I kind of feared that would be the case. And when I called Larry, he said, you know what, I've been working on this for many years, for a long time, because of sort of the shame that went along with this topic. Those who were affected weren't willing to tell their stories. And thankfully, Larry spent many years sort of priming the pump, so to speak, to get these people willing to share about their experience. And so when I asked him if we could produce a documentary about it, they welcomed it with open arms. Really, Larry was instrumental in helping us find people to interview who remember watching the FBI raid their homes and take their fathers to these detainment facilities and internment camps. So we really relied on Larry to kind of connect us with Italians who would tell their stories on film for the first time. And then submitted the application to the Film Forum, got accepted, and then we were off to the races. We had 5 months to produce the documentary. It's part of a competition. So that year in 2021, we went out to the NIAF Gala, and where we were named the winners of the Film Forum that year. And that really kind of sparked some momentum. We're trying to get the film out to as many people as we possibly could. And John Tuturro's team got a hold of the film. And John, of course, this legendary actor who's worked with some of the top directors, not only in the United States, but also in Italy, an Italian speaker himself, whose family has served in the military and comes from Sicily. So John was sort of a natural partner for us. He became an advocate for the film. And then we entered and won the Ferrara Film Festival last year. And so to screen the film in Italian with an Italian audience was also such a memorable and rewarding experience. But as I said, this has really become a passion project. So as we're kind of putting this film out there, the goal all along has been getting this story to the widest possible audience. This is something that's not taught in the history books. This is something that most people haven't seen a documentary on before. And as we interviewed these people, this happened in the 1940s. So the people who remember this are now, in most cases, in their 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. And so we knew that if we didn't capture the testimony of these events from these first-person sources now, these people aren't going to be with us forever. We knew that we would miss an opportunity to put their stories on film while they're still alive. And so we were really motivated to honor them for sharing their stories, to do a good job with this film, to produce something that we could be proud of, and then work really hard, not just to produce the film, but get it to the widest possible audience. So as many people as possible can see and can learn about what happened to the Italians who were living in America during World War II. And not only that, but also how it's affected culture going forward, how it's affected the expression of what it means to be an Italian American. And I think that's part of my own personal experience. When I talked to you at the beginning of this interview of how I grew up in this Midwestern Italian American family, but I didn't really know my great-grandparents' story and how and why they came from Italy. I wasn't really connected to their hometown or to Italy in any real way. And I didn't speak the language. My family didn't carry it on. I started to realize some of why that happened. Even if my family didn't have anybody who was actually detained and interned through this process, the argument that we make in the film is that most Italians, because of this experience, were very motivated and incentivized to blend in and to seem more American. And because of that, they sort of stopped, publishing newspapers in Italian, for example, stopped passing on the language as much as they otherwise would have in an effort to not be persecuted, in an effort to seem more American. And I think what we're left with is a little bit of a more caricature or a superficial expression of what it means to be Italian American. And we're missing out on a more full and rich and nuanced version that we would have possibly had if these events had not occurred in American history during a time of wartime hysteria.
Yes, that is correct. We had an episode about a year ago where we had a young gentleman who actually embarked on in a major bicycle experience across the U.S. to trace back where his grandfather had been kept as prisoner of war. So differently, it's like the Italians were kept twice, the ones that were captured and the ones that were here that had to endure this experience. So I would like to share the notice that that came out from the Department of Justice. If you don't mind reading the English, then I will follow with the Italian.
Yeah, this is, like you said, a notice from the U.S. Department of Justice, a notice to aliens of enemy nationalities. The United States government requires all aliens of German, Italian, or Japanese nationality to apply at post offices nearest to their place of residence for a certificate of identification. Applications must be filed between the period of February 9th through February 28th, 1942. Go to your postmaster today for printed directions, and it's signed by the Attorney General at the time, who was Francis Biddle, who's definitely a character that we discuss in the documentary.
So, avviso, il governo degli Stati Uniti ordina a tutti gli stranieri di nazionalità tedesca, italiana e giapponese di fare richiesta all'ufficio postale più prossimo al loro luogo di residenza per ottenere un certificato di identità. Le richieste devono essere fatte entro il periodo che decorre tra il 9 febbraio e il 28 febbraio 1942. Andate oggi al vostro capo d'ufficio postale, bla bla bla. So this seems to be just a notice, but we have huge numbers. And this period, this ban, so to speak, went on for quite a few months. Can you give us some numbers, what we're talking about?
Yeah, so we know that in the United States, more than 600,000 Italians were impacted by these orders. And the restrictions were most harsh mainly in the West Coast, and that's because they were most harsh near military installations. So we had a lot of Italians very dramatically impacted in, the Bay Area of California. So you're thinking cities like San Francisco and Oakland and Monterey and places like that. Also further north along the coast in Oregon and Washington, then a little bit over to the east in Arizona and other states. There were some similar cases along the East Coast and other parts of the U.S. I want to be clear that these restrictions were for anyone who had not completed the naturalization process throughout the United States, but we see the most sort of harsh restrictions on the West Coast, where there would have been naval installations and other military facilities, and then parts of the East Coast and sort of pockets around the country. But there were 600,000 people impacted by the best estimates. There were I think the numbers are 50,000 under curfew, had to carry identification cards, had personal property such as radios, flashlights, weapons, maps confiscated. I mentioned the curfew and just sort of other acts of restricted movements and surveillance, but having to go to the post office and register and carry this identification at all times. And then the most harsh conditions obviously were individuals who were detained and interned in some cases for 1 year, 2 years, or even longer.
So it could be that families were separated. The son would fall under these the curfew and the ban, and the rest of the family would be kind of living across the line.
Yeah, and that's why we call the film Potentially Dangerous. That was actually a designation that the U.S. government gave to these people. There were different categories, A, B, and C, lists that you could be on if the government considered you potentially dangerous. And it's important to point out that these people were considered potentially dangerous, not because they had committed a crime or they had done something, but essentially because of the language they spoke and where they were born. So the government said, well, you're from Italy, and we're fighting a war against Italy, and therefore you may be seeking to sabotage the government of the United States. And just in case, we better lock you up because you might want to do something. So it was all kind of based on wartime hysteria and these hypotheticals that sort of run contrary to the ideals that we're supposed to have as the United States of America. There were no constitutional rights given to these people. They were never formally accused of anything. They weren't allowed lawyers to represent them. In many cases, they didn't know what they were accused of or how they got on these lists. And there were various things that could put you on lists A, B, and C. Some of these people had fought in World War I, which is ironic because at the time they were fighting on the same side as the United States. Some of these people worked in different embassies, maybe worked for the Italian embassy in San Francisco, for example. Other people may have sent money back to their loved ones that were living in Italy. And then there were sort of the more bizarre cases that we hear about. It's covered in the documentary that there was an opera singer who was a celebrity at the time named Ezio Pinza.
Actually, we know Ezio very well because his grandson is a dear friend of mine. He lives in Pittsburgh.
And so,
and that was cute. Yes, please tell the anecdote.
And so his story is that they think his rival baritone in the opera informed on him and said that he was a spy of the Italian army only because this rival wanted his place in the opera. And the rumor about Ezio was that they believed he could either alter how fast or how slow he was singing, or perhaps hit a certain note that was rumored to be a secret code to the Italian generals. And so, as we cover in the documentary, these hypotheses are just sort of bizarre. And the other interesting thing about him and a gentleman that we feature in the documentary, we interview his daughter, is that they were detained inside Ellis Island. So that for me was one of the things that when I found out that fact, I really wanted to make this documentary, because I remember when I was maybe 16 or 17 years old, my family took our first vacation to New York City. And as Italian Americans, it was profound for us to see the Statue of Liberty. And we went to Ellis Island to see what we knew as this sort of beacon of hope for our family. And we thought, wow, when our Italian family was coming across the ocean, it must have been such a momentous occasion for them to see this grand statue and to pass through Ellis Island and to be processed and to know that they were finally on American soil where they could be free. Well, not that many years later, Italians were actually detained against their will under suspicion in the very same facility. These people were essentially jailed inside Ellis Island. And to me, that's just this endlessly fascinating juxtaposition of what it must have been like to be jailed in the shadow, of the Statue of Liberty.
So here, I would like to play again just maybe a minute of your video. Can you describe who is this gentleman and the letter that he's reading? We're not going to hear the letter, but just his reaction to the letter.
Yeah, so this is Larry DeStassi reading the letter, who I mentioned wrote the book Una Storia Segreta, and he has another book called Branded. I would encourage you to check both of them out. Larry is a wonderful historian, and we owe him a lot for the work that he's done over the last many decades. But I believe the clip you're going to play is him reading a letter from one of the internees, Louis Straulig. And Straulig is a really interesting case because, as you'll hear in this letter, he's in a facility where he's interned for being considered a potentially dangerous alien, and he has no idea what's going on. He's trying to petition Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, to let him out, and he starts really doubting himself. He says, "I'm trying so hard to be loyal to my country, but if you say I did something wrong, I guess there's some evil in my heart that I'm unaware of, and you know better than me." So it's just this tragic the depiction of self-doubt. This man says, well, if this country thinks that I did something wrong, there must be some secret evil lurking in my heart. And it's just one of the most powerful and compelling moments of the documentary.
This is the very end of it. We want people to watch the documentary, so we don't want to steal all the thunders, the beautiful moments, but this is towards the end of the letter, and then just the reaction of indeed.
Was arrested. According to radio reports and newspapers, I was accused of being potentially dangerous alien, treated and regarded as such after my arrest. After all this time in the enclosure, I do not yet know why all this. Must be some reason for, some evil I do not know, something wrong somewhere, except I am not citizen of this country, but with sincere intention and resolution to become, soon as possible, all necessary steps already made toward, and to establish my permanent home here in this country, with one born here as companion. I worked on that plan. My past record is spotless clean. I always obeyed all laws of this country. I lived to the best of my ability to the laws of God and teaching of the Catholic Church. I do not know how I am considered as potentially dangerous. What evil I made. Please let me know where I fell short in my loyalty to this country. I wish to know my weakest points, to strengthen them to perfection, to please better God, country, and neighbors. Investigation by honest person from honest people should prove my sincerity and truth. The space is too small to explain more and better. I do the best. Hoping in your kindness, I'll be waiting for your answer. Sincerely yours, Louis Joseph Straulig. Sorry.
And the reaction of, as I said, is very, very powerful, because you have a completely honest man being held, and when you were telling us before, they were not really charged with a crime, so they were in this unknown. So it must have been very devastating for them, let alone the families that all of a sudden they saw family members being taken away from them to the point of insanity, of I would assume, right? Because
yeah, and that letter even struck me that time, when you think of the era in which that letter was written, and that gentleman's probably, as you can hear in the letter, limited English skills, it's still a very powerful and beautifully written letter when he says, I wish to know my weakened points to strengthen them to perfection, to better please God, neighbor, and country. I mean, it's a beautiful sentence for someone who's probably not that proficient in English. I think it's just amazing. But we saw a lot in our research, and we were only able to share some of it in the documentary because, again, time and finances were limited. But we do know of the intense burden that this placed on families, because the people that they were taking away, unlike the Japanese experience where whole families were held together, this was primarily only the adult men who were detained and interned, and it was a huge financial burden on these families. You just think of, the 1940s, of the way these people were earning their livings as salesmen, or working in markets or doing manual labor, and to have the meager income that they were able to provide for their families all of a sudden gone was a huge burden for the people who were left at home to care for children. And then a lot of times they didn't know where their husbands were being held until they received letters back, and in many cases they were held for a short period near their hometowns, but then moved. So we had people from San Francisco, for example, who were moved to Missoula, Montana. Well, you're not going to go in 1942 from San Francisco, California to Missoula, Montana to even be able to visit someone or to get news easily about them. One of the things that became my absolute favorite part of the documentary, I hope we can do another project on this sometime. There's a woman we feature in the documentary named Marilyn Peralta Berg, whose father and I believe nephew, and uncle were held together, and one of them was held for much longer. But I believe it was her uncle and his wife who wrote back and forth almost daily, and in sometimes many times a day. And they gave to me to use and to return, of course, just this treasure trove of documents, these typewritten letters. The woman's name, she was an American woman, Mary, and she was married to the Italian man who was interned. His name is Felix or Felice. And they have these beautiful letters, hundreds, these binders, inches thick, full of typewritten letters back and forth to each other. And he was held almost longer than anyone else, I think for longer than 2 years. And these letters that they write back and forth together are just heartbreakingly beautiful. Mary is left at home, I think, with 3 children. And she, in her letters, you can understand what's happening in her brain by reading these letters. At times, she's desperate. At other times, she's hilarious. At other times, she's sort of wry and cynical. She's trying to share what's happening about the war. She's trying to tell what's happening with their growing children. She's trying to keep his spirits up. She's trying to share about her own struggles. And she's also trying to keep him informed about his case. She'll say, today I had to sell the refrigerator so I could make $50 to hire the lawyer for 2 more weeks. And if you don't come home at Christmas, I'm going to stop believing in Santa Claus. And, and when you read the letters, they're hilarious and they're heartbreaking. And it's just this wonderful document of this undying love between these 2 people and this man who is held for a reason that they don't understand. And she says in these letters, my God, what have we done? Are you a spy? And I didn't know it. I thought America was supposed to be the land of opportunity. Has God forgotten about us? And to just hear her pouring her heart out in front of this typewriter time and time again to her beloved Felice, who sits in an internment camp or a detainment cell for reasons they don't understand. It's just, like I said, endlessly fascinating, and just beautiful documents that the family shared with us. And again, grateful that they sat for the interviews and helped us tell this incredible story.
Indeed. And also you were assisted by historian Vince Ferrante from the Pittsburgh. We are in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is Pittsburgh without the H in California. Did he assist with the research, or did he have a family member himself?
Oh, that's an incredible story too. And I'm glad that when I went to Pittsburgh, California, that they were very careful to point out to me Pittsburgh without an H, because I feel like I definitely would have misspelled it in the documentary and it would have been humiliating. But Pittsburgh is a very interesting part of this story because they were sort of a sister city to a village in Sicily. And so for many years before the war, people would come to this part of California, send word back to their family members in the same village in Sicily, and they would just keep coming. And so by 1940, there were 9,000 people in Pittsburgh, California, and a huge majority of them were Italians from this village in Sicily. Well, that became a problem because during the war, any service member who was part of the United States military who was going to the Pacific Theater to fight in the war was processed through Camp Stoneman, which was in Pittsburgh, California. So you had a town of 9,000 people, many of whom were unnaturalized Italians, but you had 30,000 U.S. service members there. So obviously the U.S. government was very concerned about the safety and national security related to Pittsburgh. And so up to 2,000 people, I think 1,750 Italians were forcibly removed from their homes and evacuated from Pittsburgh, California. Now, this was an amazing sort of serendipitous event for us because we only had 5 months to shoot this film, and a lot of that went into research. And we were just speeding through town to do as many interviews as we possibly could. We were meeting with a guy, Bob Scudero, who is in the documentary. His mother, Rose, is one of the people who was evacuated from Pittsburgh, California. Well, we were supposed to meet Bob at a hotel lobby just to do the interview, and we had nothing else planned. We were trying to do 14 interviews in 11 days or something like that. We were moving very, very quickly. And I went to get food, and I sent the crew to downtown Pittsburgh just to get some B-roll footage of some buildings there. And admittedly, it was kind of a rookie mistake on our part. We didn't have time to research the Pittsburgh Historical Museum and Society and events and all of this really treasure trove of information for us. So my team was there just taking footage of the building, of the museum, thinking we would go to lunch and interview Bob. Well, a woman, I think a board member or a volunteer, came out of the building to see what my crew was doing there with the camera. And they kind of started to run away because they thought maybe they were going to get kicked out. But instead, the woman said, "Why don't you come inside this museum? We have all of this information we can tell you about, and all of these archives we can share with you." Now, ironically, the museum at the time was, as a courtesy, storing Larry DeStassi's exhibit Una Storia Segreta, which at one point was a traveling museum exhibit that went kind of all around the nation and in the U.S. Capitol and the Sacramento State House even. And Vince, they called Vince, and he came over and sat for an interview and told us all of this information and turned over all these archival photos to us that we didn't know about and we otherwise would not have had for the documentary. So it was really this chance encounter on the street that led to Vince participating in the documentary, and it became such a more rich project because of their participation. And we had the wonderful experience of the very first public screening we did of the film. They rented out a movie theater in Pittsburgh, and I think it was a 300-seat movie theater. And it was such an amazing thing because we sold out the movie theater, and most of the people who were there in attendance had family members from Pittsburgh who had been impacted by these events. So after the screening, they all stood up and kind of grabbed the microphone and shared their own stories and talked about what they remember from the stories we tell in the documentary. But for those of you who watch later, you'll see that Pittsburgh without the H is very prominently featured in the documentary, and a very important part of telling this story well.
So I'm assuming that as it was emotional for them to watch the documentary, probably was equally emotional to hear them picking up the microphone and sharing their stories. So if we're fasting forward, so what happened? What acknowledgement of this has happened since then? And what are we still waiting for?
Yeah, and as we profile in the documentary, a lot of this information was sort of classified and purposely kept secret for a long time. Well, leading up to the year 2001, by an act of Congress, the Department of Justice investigated these events fully, or as fully as possible, and produced a very thorough report. The name of it is in the documentary. It sort of escapes me now, but if you Google something like the 2001 Department of Justice official report on the wartime experience of Italian Americans during World War II, it's a public document. You can find it. There's tons and tons of footnotes, and the people who compiled the report kept very thorough records of all of their research. If you're interested, in fact, there's an appendix where you can search for your family's last name. And if they know that your family was affected or anyone with your last name, it will list where they would have been held, or if their fishing boats were confiscated, as many were in the San Francisco Wharf and other fishing waters. It'll all be listed there. That became a really important document for us. And we interview in Potentially Dangerous the woman who was charged by the U.S. Congress of compiling this report for the Department of Justice. Her name is Joanne Chiedi. She's of Italian descent herself. And so to sit with her and to ask her what it was like to interview these Italians was important. And now that act of Congress called for an official apology from the President of the United States. For whatever reason, that never really officially happened. And now we all know that the attacks of September 11th, 2001 happened shortly after this report came out. And of course, that became necessarily the priority for the US government, and a lot of other things kind of fell by the wayside and were never picked back up. So there still hasn't really been an official apology. Now, if you ask, Joanne and others, people who served in the US Congress at the time, they will tell you that in their view, that document that I mentioned kind of stands as the official recognition and sort of a pseudo kind of informal apology. But it should be noted that Congress did expect and want the President of the United States to issue an apology at that time. As we discuss in the film, most of the people that we ask say that they're not interested in sort of financial reparations or anything like that, but it would be meaningful for most of them to hear some sort of an official apology, even though all these decades have passed since these events. And our hope is that this film will continue to educate people about what the government has done, and maybe it could lead to something in the future. We've certainly had interest from members of Congress regarding a congressional screening of the film. I've been in touch with Nancy Pelosi's family, who's expressed interest in seeing the film. Secretary Leon Panetta, who is from Monterey and is deeply connected, has been supportive of the film, and his son Jimmy as well. And several others it should be noted, from both sides of the aisle really have expressed interest. And that bill from 2001 was sponsored by a Republican and had very wide bipartisan support. So I think the interest is there for people to be open to learning more about this issue. But in addition to an apology, we really hope that we can kind of change the way that history is taught. As we again discuss in the film, this isn't really covered in U.S. history books, and sometimes it might be a passing footnote or sort of an addendum to the Japanese experience. And yes, what happened to Italians at the time was much less in number, but there was still a series of injustices carried out that affected a people group in this country. At the time, Italians made up the largest foreign-born group of immigrants in the United States. They've contributed in many ways, not just fighting in the U.S. military, but also to our nation and to our culture. And I think it's very important that we get this story out and sort of correct the record of the way that our history is taught.
Wonderful. So just one last question before we have to part. I think I had caught one of your little videos from Ferrara. I think you were celebrating your being the best documentary in 2022. I was wondering what was indeed the reaction of the audience in Italy. Again, did I have anyone or was a complete new story for their ears?
I think it was new. We had a lot of audience members that came up and just kind of expressed shock. They shared that they'd always viewed America as sort of this dream, right? And the American dream. And I think maybe even their family members who had come to the US may not have wanted to kind of share these events with them. They didn't want their family back in Italy to worry or to think less of them. And so many Italians, especially all these years later, are also unaware that this happened. I do want to share with your audience, just going forward, one thing that we're very excited about is that Potentially Dangerous is now available on many PBS member stations throughout the US. Yeah, so we just started airing on PBS this March, very, very recently. I think we're going to be broadcast already in our first month on PBS in about 13 states in 4 top 10 markets. And right now, that's the easiest way to see the film. I'm also making some public appearances. I'll be at Boston University in early April. I'm also going to do an appearance at the Italian bookstore there the night before the university screening. But people can go to the website, potentiallydangerousfilm.com, and there's a link that says ways to watch /PBS screenings. And if you click on that, there's a live document. Every time we get notified that there's a new PBS member station in a city that will air the documentary, I'll put it on there. So hopefully it will be coming to your city soon. The deal that we have with PBS is that they're free to air it anywhere they want for the next 3 years. So I can't guarantee that it will be in your city. I think many of them will probably show it primarily in October for Italian American Heritage Month. But we are getting picked up in some major markets. We've got, I don't know when this interview will air, for example, but we've got San Francisco coming up, I think over the weekend or early next week, which would be the end of April. We're going to be in Los Angeles, Chicago, some other major cities. So make sure you go onto that PBS station broadcasts and keep in touch too. If people out there want to share their personal stories with me, or pick up.
I was going to say, if anyone that might listen hear this interview and realize that there is a story that needs to be added. Obviously, the documentary is done, but because you're still collecting additional stories, and who knows, maybe we will be bringing as Istituto Monte Italiano to Pittsburgh with an H.
Yeah, exactly. That would be great. And we've got DVDs available if it's not going to be on PBS soon in your market. And then just the last thing I want to say, other than thank you to everybody for listening and thank you for having me today, is that my team's always looking for the next great story out there. So don't be shy to get in touch. Part of our job as journalists and documentary filmmakers is to always be kind of keeping our ear to the ground for the next untold story that needs to be told. I always want to do something that has an Italian angle, but not necessary, just sort of an added bonus for me as a dual citizen. But we love it when people are in touch and give us feedback and share ideas with us. And that's really, like I shared before, what's become the motivating factor is to just let people know. So this story, una storia segreta, won't be a secret much longer, and set the record straight and help people connect with their culture, like this project has helped me to do. So thank you so much for having me on today.
Well, thank you very much. And our time together is up. Il Big Ben ha detto stop. It's time for us to say arrivederci e alla prossima. We want to thank you for tuning into the program. If you have any questions or comments, or if you have any topic you would like us to address, please contact us at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, please visit our website at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org and click on the Italian Radio Hour tab. You can also subscribe to the Italian Radio Hour on YouTube or whenever you catch your favorite podcasts. We would like to thank our guest, Zac Baliva, our sponsors, Istituto Mondo Italiano, La Prima Espresso, and Alla Boara for the music. Until next time, alla prossima. Ciao, ciao.